Again, my name is Michael Hicks. When we embarked upon this project we answered an RFP to the Institute for Advanced Learning and Research in Danville late last spring, and working in universities, the final contract was emailed to me last Tuesday with everything closed out. So we are rather early in the process here. And I just want to recap what you've heard today and where we are. We actually have several hundred variables, so there hasn't been a data point we've talked about today that we don't have. We just haven't had time to go through the technical analysis that would sort of lay that out. So the first thing you heard from Emily this morning is a way to think about your community differently, right? We showed you maps that have indices. We can create indices endlessly. The important portion of the comprehensive wealth framework is the way you think about your community, not how it's depicted to you. That's the central element. So when we go back and do qualitative research, Emily mentioned it earlier, we're going to choose communities to do qualitative research because they're outliers. And the reason we're doing this, which we think is one of the two big research innovations of this stream of research, is because qualitative research is extraordinarily costly. It's time intensive. It requires a great deal of preparatory training. It involves working with human subjects in places that are oftentimes difficult to get to and to remain at and to schedule over a visit period. And so we want to isolate those places that are going to yield some information about us. If we were to do qualitative research in all these communities, we would learn nothing really valuable. I don't believe. Qualitative research, that we're going to go to the places that we think are there's something about them that doesn't correspond to the observational data that we have derived from them. And so I'll talk more about that as we go along. The second sort of innovation is what you heard from Amanda. So there are endless studies on quality of life, and they come in two types. One is using micro data on urban places because that's what we have data on from IPUM's, the individual micro data, right? And that framework of using a statistical model to test what your wages would be and what your home values would be, which is the primary variance in cost between places, is well established in the literature. It's used by everybody who does this work. That work does not extend to rural or micropolitan areas because the micro data are not available there. They're just aggregated at entire micropolitan or all non-metro areas within a state. So it's very unsuitable for the geographically disaggregated purposes that we provide here. The second type of study on amenities simply do correlates of amenities of some type. And you've seen many of these, that these things matter. We're going to correlate with them with population growth. And they involve raw correlations. There's no theory underlying of why people like mountains, right? Our preferences vary. Amanda mentioned going to a yoga parlor. It's my hope to never enter one, to end my days not having been to one. And so what we have done here is the standard that's used in the micro data that says we're going to measure wages and we're going to use job characteristics to measure those wages. And wages are a price of labor, right? And then we're going to look at home prices. And we're going to look at a lot of characteristics that value homes, holds everything equal. And then the unexplained variance is that quality of life. The difference between those two is the quality of life. And if you don't believe that holding other things equal, that price means something, economists have nothing to say to you at any time in your life. That is the central element of this discipline, that prices reveal people's preferences to supply labor or to buy a home, and businesses view the same way about to supply goods or services and where they locate. So this is a huge innovation that we've been able to take the microeconomic data. Amanda's one of the scholars that works in this very effectively right now. She's breaking them, we're working on some immigration work. She's done gender work in this, but we're able to aggregate this and demonstrate that aggregation process works in the urban places. We think it works in the rural. Until the data appears more fully, we won't know this. But we believe that this is working well. So if you don't believe that those prices matter, all things being equal, you should zone out economists all the rest of your life, right? What we do know from the second piece of research, the quality of life matters, quality of business and environment doesn't seem to matter very much in terms of population or employment growth. And I'll frame this in a context in a minute, but they interact with each other regionally in ways that are important. And that's going to be something we explore both today and down the road. And I will tell you that we talk about regionalism all the time. I testified in the state legislature about 10 weeks ago on a regional plan in Indiana that's a follow-up of then Governor Pence's Regional Cities Initiative. And the question I was asked by a member of the General Assembly, the Senate, was, please, tell me, Dr. Hicks, what's the empirical evidence that regionalism works? And there isn't any until what you have seen today. That regression that Amanda showed is the single most empirically convincing evidence that working regionally matters to your employment or population growth. And we'll talk more about that. Right? So where are we going to go to? We're going to think through the implications of this. We're going to connect it to some other data. Then we're going to talk about some of the micropolitans out here. We're going to talk, I'm going to talk quickly because of time. I'm going to talk about public policy. And then I'm going to talk about new research that needs to be done on the questions that we've talked about today. Then I'm going to talk about policy analysis that has to be done about the questions we talked today, and then I'll take your questions. Right, so before I go to the next slide, I want to tell you I'm a retired Army officer. So I love cordite and diesel fuel and asphalt smell. I love manufacturing. We do the manufacturing index at Ball State. Has been reported in probably most of your newspapers over the past decade. I'd much rather be in a factory with stuff going than in a yoga parlor anytime, right? But I'm fixing to say some unpleasant things about the future of manufacturing. And when we think about this, I'm going to show you some graphics here that break all types of jobs into two types. One are called footloose jobs. And footloose jobs are what Ross Duvall talked about yesterday. Those are exporting jobs, jobs that things are produced locally and then they're exported outside of your region. Most of the consumption of that good or service does not occur locally. So think a GM factory. All the workers may drive GM cars, but most of the things that are made there are going to be exported elsewhere. Those are footloose jobs. They can go anywhere. They're both goods and services. And then there's non-footloose jobs. Non-footloose jobs have to go to the places that people live. Their service or the good that they produce are consumed locally around the people that surround that neighborhood. And so I'm going to show you a national map from the time that I was a lad until the present that breaks all the cumulative job creation in the United States since 1969 to 2018 into those two categories. And I actually split out the service and good producing footloose jobs. And here's what we have. I'll see if I can, even smaller little dot here. This top line are non-footloose jobs. The United States since 1970 has been a job creation machine. We've created 90 million new non-footloose jobs, jobs that go to the places that people have to be. These are place-dependent jobs. When it comes to goods producing footloose jobs, we're negative, and we've been negative for 30 years. And the reason I break this out is because the service-producing footloose jobs are things like Microsoft and Boeing's corporate headquarters and Amazon. Because I don't really think they're footloose. They're going to go to the places that people go to. Right? So they're footloose in the sense that they're selling that software all around the country, but they're not footloose because the only thing that really matters to those companies are the people that work in them and the intellectual capital that they bring into that work. Now let's look at this for micropolitan areas. So back up just a minute. So economic developers, if there are any out there, when you're doing incentives, where are you spending your money? Right here, right? That's where tax incentives go. Who pays the tax incentives? Either directly if they're a direct training subsidy, or in opportunity cost in taxes not collected for things like school spending, or lower public services because the police officers or fire department is spread out across more. It's the job creators up here. All right? Now let's look what's happened in micropolitan areas in the United States. I'm just going to look now in the 21st century, 2001 to 2017, 1 million more jobs, a little over 1 million net new jobs. Footloose jobs, negative. If your strategy is to attract footloose jobs, people who respond to incentives, you're going to be very disappointed. These graphics actually come from a study of why have state and local economic development policies been so disappointing, which I wrote 3 years ago. So I'm going to link the graphics that I just presented to you in micropolitan areas to the empirics on job creation and quality of life and quality of the business environment. The top one here is the quality of life measure, right? So if you don't believe prices, ignore economists. If you don't believe prices are a signal of preferences, you should ignore economists. The graphic that Emily showed is in the upper right, or Amanda showed is in the upper right corner here, right? That's the correlation between quality of life measures and jobs. It's really strong. It's stronger. The quality of life correlation to job growth is stronger than the quality of life and population growth. And the reason that is that the jobs that are being created here to support the people that are living here, right? These non-footloose jobs are the ones that are responding to household demand. And on the lower graphic, these are the footloose jobs. They care about the business environment a lot. So manufacturers are going to care a lot about the tax, right? Local tax rate. Do software companies care about local tax rates? I'm sure they say they do. But then again, look where they're at. Again, we reveal our preferences, our willingness to pay, or our willingness to accept based on our location decision and what we pay. If you don't believe that revealed preference of human behavior, economists ain't got nothing to say to you. So this graphic depicts what's happening in micropolitan areas. The job growth is coming because people are coming there. Jobs are chasing population. How are micropolitan regions actually doing? So I have a number of graphics here on the micropolitan data. This is 21st century, so it's 2001 to 2017. I'm going to read it to you because I think it's kind of hard to see in the back. Personal income in inflation-adjusted terms down 1.1%. Farm, and by the way, personal incomes includes transfer payments, so it's not just earnings, it's transfer payments and earnings. Farm earnings down 45%. That's probably a 2017 shock, but it's a significant. Non-farm earnings down 6.3% in micropolitan areas. So in terms of market earnings, it's down. So the difference between the wage decline and the income decline is the sustainment of transfer payments in micropolitan areas. Proprietors' income way down 13%, wages and salaries 7.1%. Now the bottom graphic here, this table is employment. Employment looks differently. Farm proprietors' employment, people who own farms, are down 16%, right? Non-farm proprietors' employment is up 30%, right? So micropolitan areas look like they're creating more entrepreneurial type jobs. Some of them are just 1099s, but proprietors typically have employment in their data. Private non-farm employment is up and wage and salary employment is up, but not at the national level, okay? And where are these occurring? So this graphic of the big losses, and I'm sorry for the size here, the biggest loss is 400,000 manufacturing jobs out of about 11.5 million jobs in micropolitan areas, right? That's a 20% decline in jobs. It's actually lower than the national loss of manufacturing jobs from 2000 to 2010. We lost about a third, 25% to 28% really, of manufacturing employment, about 5.7 million jobs. We've gained about 1.2 million back. We are at the end of the longest manufacturing expansion, uninterrupted manufacturing expansion in U.S. history. Let me say that again. We are at the end of the longest manufacturing employment expansion in United States history. And mostly because manufacturing and productivity growth has been dismal, zero. Nothing's happening. And so as demand goes up, we have to bring more workers in to fill those needs. That's changing. That's for a different conversation. Manufacturing job losses are going to be concentrated in fewer places than other job losses. Retail trade down 4.2%. That's actually surprisingly good given the expansion of online shopping during this time period. Information's down about 34,000 jobs. Not really a big deal across an 11 million worker geography in the United States, 531 micropolitan areas, 641 counties, 27 million people, 11.5 million workers. Construction down, military down, state government down. Here's some modest growth for you, and these are a lot of sectors. They'll be in the final report. You can look at the slide yourself. I pulled out a few. Educational services, arts, entertainment, and recreation are doing well, but the educational services are about 34,000 jobs. Those are reasonably large numbers. I would point out that professional services, other services, management of companies, educational services, those are probably the outsourcing locally of manufacturing jobs. Those were probably manufacturing jobs in 2000, 2001, but they've been spun off. A significant share of the manufacturing job losses have been taken up by other activities. And then here's the big gainers, right? Mining and quarrying. Amanda is, again, one of the scholars on the shale boom. 77,000 jobs. Finance and insurance has grown 25% in micropolitan areas. One of the great mysteries in finance and banking is the sustainment of employment in this sector despite the technological gains in the area, all right? Waste management, that's 100,000 jobs. A big chunk of that may be factory jobs that are really spun out and privatized or locally outsourced by the manufacturing firm. And then other big numbers, accommodation, food service, real estate, and then the biggie that grows all the time, healthcare. All right, 25% job growth. What about individual micropolitan areas? So you got 27 million, grew by only 200,000 since 2010, but almost 800,000 people in 2010 were immigrants. We'll talk more about that down the road. Immigration is a big deal. There's more immigrants in micropolitan areas than there's been population growth this century. Micropolitan areas, a lot of households, surprisingly small share of single-parent households. Smaller than the national average, younger than the national average. About 47% of jobs in the United States are at some automation risk. 58% of them in micropolitan areas are. If you looked at Findlay, Ohio yesterday, Ross Duvall talked about that. Let's be honest, they're a big Whirlpool manufacturer there. The reason they're manufacturing there is because they automated factories and closed them down in Evansville and in a small town outside of Des Moines. Pretty soon those jobs are going to be gone too. 280,000 businesses, 7.4 million homeowners, and about 3 million renters. And I'm just going to look really quickly, because of the time issue here, through some of the select micropolitan areas. So this is a quality of life measure. That's the theta wage minus rents, and this is the quality of business. This is the sum of them. So Wabash is very close to the origin. These are people that I knew from the list who were coming, right? I didn't get you all. Rocky Mount, there are 3 counties here. This county is just the one county. The other 2 are very close. Higher quality of life, right? Lower quality of business. And Danville, again, higher quality of life, lower quality of business. We're looking at additional data. These are 2 data points. One on the left is from the Internal Revenue Service. These are movements of more than 5 people in and out of your micropolitan area. The county that you're in, it's a county designation. And you can see your competitors here, if you're in Danville, are really the coasts, colleges probably. And on the right are Facebook connections. This is actually, New York Times has a website used from data published in the Journal of Economic Literature on Facebook connections. we're going to exploit this data in future research. Where are people looking at on Facebook feed? There's a working hypothesis that we're interested in understanding is that the internet has accommodated a lot more information about communities, or at least reduced the cost of finding out information about schools, about communities, about activities that occur, so that there could be significant changes here. But underlying all this, despite what Ross said yesterday, is a flattening of population migration within the United States. It's dropped off significantly. And David Autor earlier this year at his Ely address, the American Economic Association, attributed that to people moving to opportunity and then staying there. Danville population. And by the way, anytime you see these jumps, right, it's usually because of a redesignation by the state of Virginia a couple of times to make economists go mad over the data there, right? Franklin, Virginia, same sort of story, different patterns, right? And some of us mused, I think that's military installations play very high on this, but look at the migration here in Franklin. It's all within a county or two away. And we suppress fewer than 5 people moving because then they would be identifiable. But people aren't moving long distances in and out to Franklin, they're moving from nearby. Population growth, and like many micropolitan areas, has flattened in the past few years. So job growth, GDP growth, things that economists care about in trying to get a sense of what's occurring in the economy have really flattened since the end of the Great Recession. Here's Rocky Mount. There's 3 counties here, right? A lot more connections, right? Somebody's moving to and from Newark in big numbers. Having lived in New Jersey for a number of years, I have a hard time understanding why they would do that, but there it is. But much less spread with Facebook connections, which I thought interesting. And these are just 2 of the counties. Wilson, North Carolina, more migration in and out of Wilson, and again, a smaller Facebook profile. And by the way, Facebook's really interesting, but like my teenage daughter is 20, and she doesn't have a Facebook anymore. She thinks that's for old people. If I'm lucky, I will have lived my entire life and not used Facebook from its birth to its death. In Wilson. Wabash, Indiana, close to us, right? In fact, that migration right there is to Muncie. Those are students moving to Ball State, chirp, chirp, from nearby Wabash. Facebook connections very dense in Indiana. That's very surprising to me. Right, and so this is, again, a little bit harder to see because of the distance. These are the wealth framework depicted outside of a map. This is an asset-based mapping, or an asset-based way of thinking about your community. So it's not good to think of it in terms of negatives or positive. It's good to think about it in relative terms compared to the other wealths that you have. And places are more likely to be strong in one or weak in another. There are certainly places that are weak across the board and other places that are stronger across the board. There's variation there, but that doesn't help you do anything with it. What really helps you is better understanding where you may be strong or where you may be weak. And again, this is not a measurement tool. If it were, it would just fall victim to Goodhart's law, right? Which is that any measurement tool, once the target of the measurement becomes the target for policy, it ceases being a valuable instrument for measurement. So we want this wealth framework as a way to think about your problems and your opportunities, not a measure that you want to just benchmark against to get better. So what are the policy matters that affect micropolitan areas? So there's national talk, if you've read Tim Bartik's work or Richard Florida's recent work about place-based economic development strategies. I'm pretty sure these are, when Tim Bartik or Richard Florida are talking about these things, they're not thinking about Rocky Mount or Wilson or Franklin. They're thinking about Toledo or Muncie or Terre Haute or Peoria, smaller metropolitan areas, and they're concerned about the divergence that economists stopped worrying about in the 1920s. Amanda didn't go into it, but economists not only didn't have data on micropolitan rural areas, we stopped caring about it. Right? Rural sociology departments started to shrink in the 1990s. Things were going well. The rural-urban divide issue wasn't important, and we really worried about superstar cities. So much of the sort of regional urban economic research or economic geography has been about big places. State-based policies, right? A number of states have tried these. Regional cities in Indiana, it was an example of a mechanism by which we could create more robust, small metropolitan places. We also have others, stellar regions, which are designed to help regions or cities that many of them are micropolitan in scale, do better. And then they're local based. These are quality of life. These are the things that we think are going to likely make a difference in your community that you might be working on. A lot of them are employment and labor productivity based. So if you read Tim Bartik's work on place-based strategies, it's all about how to make manufacturing more productive, right? Or how to strengthen sectors that are there. What happens in an industry when it gets more productive? Right? What happened in farm? Does anybody know the record year for farm employment in America? As the share of our population, about 1904, total number sometime in the 30s probably. All right, what was the record production year? Yes, last year we have data. Let me do the same drill on manufacturing. What was our record? What was the peak manufacturing year in the United States for employment? '79. What was the peak production year? I think in 2017, probably. We started slowing down in the second half of 2018. Right, so I'm just going to be frank, we don't have a lot of place-based policies nationally that do the types of things that have been evidence to do the type of things that would cause sustained employment, not employment growth, but just sustained employment and then maybe income growth in micropolitan areas, where there's a dearth of research on that. We'll talk about it. And let's think about some of the things that Emily talked about earlier, the framework of the WELS, and then we'll take the data that Amanda did. This is our first suite. We have 700 or 800 different variables to look at, and I'll talk more about that as I go along. But we look first at natural amenities, right? You can't change them, but there's a couple of interesting things. The more variables you add to a model, right, the lower the impact of natural amenities on population and employment growth, right? The less correlated they are with quality of life. So you can certainly introduce public amenities or private amenities that will, if you have weaknesses in natural amenities in terms of what people value, you can certainly offset that with some other public policies, right? But you have to think about these in the framework of comprehensive wealth. Public amenities are very hard to measure. We don't have good measures of school quality. I wish we did. We sure don't, right? But households sure respond to them very strongly, right? Households are willing to bid up prices to live in places that are spending more money for school. So when people talk to you about taxes, just remind them, yeah, sure, taxes matter. But if taxes matter as much as anybody would put in a big conversation, then San Francisco would be empty right now, and Muncie would be full of people. And you can buy many a home in Muncie for $5,000 that in San Francisco would top $2 million. Again, if you don't believe prices matter, economists have nothing useful to communicate to you. Public amenities are very, we think they cluster together, right? Probably is easy to measure sort of crime rate and school quality because public amenities tend to cluster. You tend to be good at all those sorts of things. Places have low crime rates, potholes, there's endogeneity here. And I hope this sort of illustrates why just throwing amenities into a regression without theory behind it does nothing for you. So the earlier studies of amenities, we don't think guide us very much in rural and micropolitan places because if you don't have some way to sort of tease out what people actually behavior, they're voting with their feet, they're expressing preferences, you don't learn very much useful from this. And then private amenities, they influence a lot of the different wealths. You have less control on them in many ways than you think, and the blunt measures don't work. So the total number of establishments for eating and drinking are negative, right? So we don't know why that is. We think there's a brand new paper published last week that actually measured chains as a negative quality in stores. So we're gonna, in restaurants, so we're gonna use chain stores as a measure of this. But I think it's really gonna be qualitative research that tells us the story. So we're gonna look at some outliers in some of these measures and then send Emily to them. We hope they're in cold and inexpensive places in the middle of winter, right? So the economists get to pick where the sociologists go. It's a beautiful thing. And we think this is really, the limits on economic data are going to be, I think, addressed by the qualitative research to talk about what are, if a bunch of gas station restaurants by an exit may be negatively correlated with quality of life. It would be very different than what we see here, the 1918 and the bottle house, right? But that's not going to be revealed to us in BEA data. And I'd just add that the private amenities and households are the new tax base, right? It's not factory jobs. We don't tax factories in America anymore. We're so desperate we just cut their taxes virtually to zero. These high work at home, so the last thing I want to do, why does the wealth framework, and why do the empirics matter? So the work at home data, the proprietors data is teasing out something here that we have to think about. Why are the proprietors data positive for micropolitan areas? Why does the high work at home measure in the census correlate with quality of life? Well, it may be that there are things that there may be some endogeneity here. It may be that if I'm going to work at home, I'm only going to work at home in a place that's nice. I'm not going to work at home in a place that's crummy. I'd rather go off to a job that's at least in an interesting place. It could be caused by the quality of life might be caused by high share of people who are living locally and they want to work in coffee shops or they want to do things locally. And it could be that there's shared assets like broadband that cut across the quality of business environment for certain types of businesses, and so they really enable a lot of people to work at home, and in other places that may not have that access, you don't see as many. So looking at this through this wealth framework, I think is a big improvement. And then that's policy spillover. If I do broadband for quality of life, which I think is the empirical argument for it, does that reduce my cost of schooling? Right, where Indiana just had a teacher strike yesterday, so they closed over half the schools, but my kid still got to do his homework because we have broadband and they had a digital learning day. So most of the schools that closed had broadband in communities at enough level that kids can take their homework home and have a digital learning day. It's great when the snow comes. We don't have to worry about risking kids getting to school or staying late in the summer. We just have a digital learning day. The cost of education is lower on some domains with more broadband. So there are policy spillovers here that I think are important, and we think the qualitative research will tease out more of this. We're also looking at other things. Here's immigration. On the vertical axis is the number of immigrants, and the bottom axis here is population change since 2001 to 2017. All right, so we're seeing, 2010 to 2017, places with more immigrants tend to grow faster. We asked about job quality earlier, right? So we think that's important. We think job quality is important. We don't think the wage captures everything about well, we do. We're economists. Wages capture almost everything about a job, right, in each place. But there are things about those jobs that may be interesting from a policy standpoint. So we're very interested, for example, in labor market stability. How much does stability in the job matter? So we looked at the quality of life, and we found that more concentrated industries here, right, this is the industrial concentration using a Herfindahl-Hirschman index, was negative. So if you have just one big employer, that's a negative quality of life issue. We think that's a view of labor markets that may be an issue. Automation risk, really, really much bigger effect. The more at risk your job is of automation in your community, the lower the quality of life. Import exposure, didn't matter, no statistical measurement here. The China shock didn't affect quality of life. And then education training dollars. negative and highly statistically significant. I don't know why. Is that because we're pouring more training dollars into places that maybe need more help? Is the question really a labor market question, or is it a place-based question? We don't know. This research will answer some of that. And then finally, in terms of the other research, one of the benefits, and Emily talked about it, so I won't spend as much, but typically qualitative research occurs in parallel with quantitative research. So if we were, a typical study proposal would be, we're going to send some people to some places and they're going to look at it and they're going to tell us what the qualitative research says using their techniques, their methods, and then we're going to have a group of people doing parallel empirical work. We don't work that way. What we do is do the empirical work. It's less expensive. We can do it more quickly. We identify the outliers. These are the places that most likely the data don't tell us what we need to know. So we know everything we need to know about Pecos, Texas from a regression model and the share of employment and the gender differences in that community. It's a man camp hub, right? That's what Ross talked about. I don't need to go to Pecos, Texas. The data tells me what I need to know about that place. But there are other places that I don't understand why they wouldn't be doing well. What would be the issue? So Harrison, Arkansas is this example here. So Harrison, Arkansas is a negative outlier. So we looked at all these. Harrison, Arkansas. So the foothills of the Ozarks, it seems to be I've actually been to there in Fayetteville. It seemed like a nice place to live. I mean, it's pretty. The weather is fairly moderate by most measures. It has a FedEx hub. It has a university. It has a cute downtown. At least the Chamber of Commerce pictures suggest that. They all do, I know. But this one looked really attractive to me. And then we looked at the Wikipedia page, and here's the first entrance about the community. The predominantly white community is noted for its history of racism, which includes 2 race riots in the early 20th century and an influx of white supremacist activity in the late 20th and 21st centuries. Right? Ladies and gentlemen, if prices and revealed preferences, if you don't believe economists on prices and wages and the revealed preferences of households by their location decisions mean something, ignore all economists. That otherwise cute little place in Harrison, people are voting with their feet away from, and that's expressed in the value of homes and the willingness to accept a lower wage to work there. We think that's a place ripe for work. But it's not just that we're going to say, Emily, this is where she gets us back. We're going to send Emily and her team to Harrison, perhaps, or I'm not going to tell her yet which ones we're going to send her to. But then she's going to go there and say, gosh, you know what I discovered? It's definitely a race issue, so you guys need to go get more race data. So we've already downloaded the lynchings database. We're going to look at that to see whether or not history of racism plays a role in the problems that communities may have. So she gets us back by forcing us to find data that may be more difficult. I'd rather have my job. I'm with Amanda on the equations. So the wrap up here, this empirical work is not a panacea. It's not an easy answer in these places, in micropolitan places or metropolitan places or rural places. And I'm not suggesting that the empirical results of a single regression or a single study will tell you everything you need to know. But what you've heard today from this team is a strategy for evaluating places that are most likely to tease out the most interesting information for us. You have heard about an empirical method that bridged the huge data problem that non-metropolitan areas have. And we've at least calibrated that, and we can demonstrate that it works well in urban places, so we suppose that it probably works in rural places. I know there are a number of groups here. Aspen's new development hub study talks about the need for more data. Folks, we're a generation away from that. I won't be a working economist in 25 years when those data are available, so we have to do something in between. This is how we do it. All right? The imperfections of the data, the raw count, the counting of a McDonald's, just like the 1918 restaurant here, can be fixed A, through qualitative research, and B, through doing something different with the data. Maybe we can do some web scratching to find Yelp reviews of restaurants in communities. So we're talking with another economist about maybe using her algorithm to do that. Much of the traditional economic development thinking is still stuck in the 1970s, right? You're not going to get jobs by having a much improved business environment. certainly not in micropolitan areas as we've seen here today. And the job growth that's been taken over the country for 75 years is focused primarily in non-footloose jobs. Jobs are going to the places that people are, and in micropolitan places, that's a pretty good story because you're seeing a lot more of the proprietor's income, or excuse me, at least employment at this time. We also think, and we know because we testify fairly frequently in front of General Assemblies on these issues, that the small p politics of all of the questions here are important. We think the wealth framework provides a venue for talking about this. Again, it's not just a metric that you throw up, it's a way of thinking differently that we're working with economic developers and community foundations in Indiana to work through and develop some training maybe on how to do this in your place. What are our next steps? For the study itself, we're going to pick outlier communities. The dates there suggest places in Nebraska and Michigan, not Hawaii or Florida, Emily. So we're going in February through May. We intend to do our visits. We're going to do a case study of a lot more outliers. We can't visit 100 places, but we could do 100 places of case studies. Case studies are a lower cost qualitative research. And then we're going to provide the models that you have seen here in detail in appendices and the implications in a study that we're going to report back to IALR this time next year. And that will also have a website available so that most of those 700-800 data points that we have available, you'll be able to download for your community to look at and place them into some context, right? So it's not data by itself or silent. Data has to have some story, either a theory and a hypothesis with it or some analysis to tell us something, but we hope to have that for everybody here. But there's also research questions that shouldn't end with this work. They won't end with this work. Qualitative evaluation of amenities, not just the field work here, but going to places to look at specific amenities. What are the flow of benefits that come from specific amenities that we think are important? We talked about this, the question was asked about intergenerational mobility. These things matter. We think that, and we know already that correlations exist between quality of life and these measures. People sense intergenerational mobility when they go places. They sense the income inequality that were expressed in a Gini index. We think those play a role in where people choose to live, right? Built environment, and that also plays into the social determinants of health and the way they matter to micropolitan areas, and we know from the regressions that Amanda did that health matters to places. So why does it matter? Why do I choose a place? Why is the revealed preference for willing to accept a lower wage and pay more for a house correlated with the social determinants of health? There's research on that, but certainly not at micropolitan areas using these measures. Occupational distribution, trade, and automation risk. We care about wages. We care about occupation distribution. Amanda just finished a recent study on looking at communities and how they survived the Great Recession given their mix of occupations and skill sets. We're going to adapt some of that research here. Opportunity cost of land use decisions, right? We ask a question. We had a planner. They always ask the planning question, right? And it's not just land use decisions in terms of zoning, but if you have golf courses in your downtowns, and you also have a affordable housing shortage, is the opportunity cost of that within your urban sphere causing problems? Spillovers between amenity types, particularly in public amenities, are important to us. That's what I talked about before. The argument that I have made to our General Assembly is that broadband cuts educational costs. That's a spillover. If you don't think about those in a comprehensive wealth framework, right, not just in the community, but in a benefit cost analysis at the General Assembly, you miss some important points. And then wealth distribution and those other issues. And then there are policy research, right? And I'm very concerned that the national place-based policy debate is going to zip right by communities like Rocky Mount and Danville and Franklin and Wilson and Connorsville, Indiana, and Winchester, Indiana, right? And they're going to focus on Toledo and Cincinnati and Dayton and Peoria that are doing poorly but have a lot more people in them to voice their concern with the current economic climate. Are there good state models? We have 50 laboratories of states that can tell us things about development options. Do active labor market policies help or hurt, right? Do we construct labor market policies that incentivize businesses to automate? That's, I think, clearly what we've seen over the past 10 or 15 years is a significant subsidization of capital investment. It's very high in the 2000s. And the question, I think, Katrina, you asked it, should place-based policies focus on people, right, and making their well-being better, or are we just worried about more jobs? How much of your well-being is tied up with your job? And should place-based policies really leave us with that? And the argument that Emily and I make when we talk in community, so what if I'm wrong? What if economists are all wrong about all these ideas that we've been writing about for 75 or 100 years? And you go ahead and follow these place-based policies, or people just, you're not going to get more people, maybe you're just better off. That, by the way, is a very robust argument. It tends to win the day in places where people might be skeptical about prices, or that home prices reveal something about the nature of the community. What incentives do work? There's abundant literature on tax incentive I've contributed to what does and does not work. And I think we're going to move towards understanding what sorts of incentives might actually incentivize jobs that are going to be stable and solid in a community, right? And then connectivity issues. The strongest argument for regionalism or regional planning, economic development authority regions, for example, lies in the empirics that you saw this morning. There is no other good evidence that works in empirical evidence. There's a lot of anecdote. There's a lot of purely qualitative research that suggests you get better outcomes from working across county borders. This is the first empirical research that we've seen, at least the most convincing empirical research on this, right? And with that, I think I have a few minutes for questions.
I actually have a question about your definitions. When you talk about entrepreneurship, proprietorship, and 1099s all in the same breath, how are you measuring entrepreneurship and whether there is entrepreneurial growth? Because 1099 workers, I think, are very different than sole proprietors, even though IRS does not count them that way.
Great question. So in the empirics that we showed you here, it's simply the proprietor's measure, which is you have to be a sole proprietor, you're receiving a 1099, or you have employees. So it's income that goes to the owner of that business, right? So it could be stock ownership, usually not through dividends. It's usually actually owning a restaurant or something like that. All right, but the IRS has more granular data. We just haven't had the time to exploit yet.
Questions?
Hi. Are you linking this work with other organizations that very much are similarly based and certainly thinking about data, thinking of incentives, things like Good Jobs First? Greg Leroy and that body of information he has about the impact of incentives, or the National Governors Association and the conversations they're having around a rural policy. Certainly, depending on what their priority is per year, they have a lot of good practice work that comes out thinking about policy solutions. So how are you thinking about the linkages you have with other folks?
You're right. It's a great question. I know Greg Leroy well. I've written a number of studies using their data and testified in 4 state legislatures on tax incentives. So yeah, we're going to use some of that in these areas. The data at the county level is pretty poor, right? We don't know about tax abatements nearly as well, and property tax abatements through that data set. So we don't really know the opportunity cost that most communities think about. So if you use an EDGE credit or a jobs training tax credit in Georgia or Indiana or Michigan, those are state level credits. Most of the property tax credits are local, so we don't have nearly as good a data on it. We have good state data on it. And I know they have a database on it, but that they miss.
So are there ways to drive more of that work that's being done toward micropolitan communities and developing out, really changing sort of the systems for data.
Oh, right. Well, so the studies that I've offered, my colleague Dagny Falk at Ball State, who's well known on the job tax credits, goes down to the county level, firm level and county level on this, right? So there's abundant research on it. And what it tells us, I think, is this. You can incentivize employment growth. It is extraordinarily expensive, right? If it's Foxconn, it's $2.5 million a job. If it's Amazon.com, it's $150,000 to $200,000 a job each year for a decade, right? Typically, place-based incentives are in the $30,000 to $60,000 a job range each year. And you think about that, Lilly headquarters in Indiana just authorized an incentive for a $400 billion tax or $400 billion investment, brings 100 jobs, right? Or it's 400 million and 100 jobs. So that's $4 million a job. So the tax abatement on that at 3% of 4 million is $120 million a job per year for 10 years. So it's not hard to impute the math. The question is, would that business be there but for the tax incentive or not? And the best work in that is from Tim Bartik, 3%, 25% probability that they would not be there otherwise. So it's a very low number. So in reality, then you would divide optimistically that $120,000 per job by 0.25. That give you what, $5 million or $500,000, $600,000 per job per year. And so the incentive piece is very expensive. And the opportunity cost isn't the dollars necessarily measured in that way. It's dollars spent on schools, it's dollars spent on policing, it's dollars spent on infrastructure that people care about, right? So that's the opportunity cost we're trying to link back through. And if you go through the example that Emily did with the wealth framework, then when you're doing a tax incentive, you're thinking about what happens to the school. You're thinking about what happens to social services if you're incentivizing $16 an hour jobs, which aren't enough to raise a family on, right? So that's the role of the comprehensive wealth framework. We as economists can do these estimates, but if we don't have a context for communicating them or thinking about them, we don't have a tool to translate those equations that we love into actions by households. So that's what this is designed to do. And the answer is yes, we're not against incentives, we're against bad analysis.
So I know you talk about equity and inequity as a future research topic. I think that a lot of the communities that have participated in the Home of Future Thinking events are really struggling with, is poverty getting better or worse? And to the extent that you can include we were just talking about incentives. Do incentives reduce poverty? Do they increase poverty? The slide you had about footloose versus non-footloose, that's the best explanation of a Trump supporter I've seen. Because the people that are looking for the high wage jobs that used to have them, they have suffered from the disappearance of the manufacturing jobs. So trying to weave in at an earlier stage some analysis of, is what we're trying to do making poverty better in this country, or is it making it worse? So in the communities I work in, a lot of people think that government can't reduce poverty, no matter what it does. And so why do anything? So I call on you to put that in the mix earlier rather than the classic, well, that's something we'll look at in the next phase of this work. Because for a lot of us that are trying to make arguments in our communities about why you invest more in schools or changing the economy or that type of thing, the poverty issue is central and the inequity issue is central.
I agree. Thank you all.